Okay, welcome everybody. Good to see everybody here. Before we get into the main body of the call, I'm just going to give a little intro to the Co-Intelligence Institute and what we do. Co-Intelligence Institute is a non-profit organization, and our work is to promote innovations in collective wisdom, co-creativity, and collaborative governance. We are seeking to bring forth the amplification of broader forms of intelligence, which act as a remedy to dominant and narrow short-term intelligence. So what we do is we focus on exploring what we call co-intelligence, a term coined by Tom Atlee, our founder, who's with us today, meaning intelligence that embraces wholeness, interconnectedness, and co-creativity. In much of our work, we ask the question, what would intelligence look like? Where could it lead if we took these deeper realities seriously? We also focus on growing wise democracy, which is the practical application of co-intelligence in our systems of governance. Wise democracy points to our capacity to reach wise collaborative outcomes. So what does this mean concretely? Well, we share real life stories, case studies of other people's good work, and approaches to complex challenges of our time. We promote and develop tools like pattern languages, group processes, and digital platforms to evoke and engage greater collective wisdom. And last but not least, we welcome people into learning communities, like on this call today, where we can all deepen our understanding of co-intelligence and develop capacity for wise relating and living well together. So these monthly learning calls are designed for us to learn from and with practitioners like Rich, who are on the leading edge of what we call real-world co-intelligence. So the program for today, which I'm going to post into the chat. So we are hearing from Rich Wilson today about his work with is it Iswe or ISWE? How do you pronounce Iswe?
Iswe. It is not an acronym.
It's Iswe on new models. So his work with Iswe on new models of citizens' deliberation and the Convention of the Future Armenian. Then Tom will offer some reflections drawing on patterns from the Wise Democracy pattern language. After that, we'll give you all a chance to reflect. I don't think we'll have breakout groups today because we're a smaller group. And in the remaining time, we'll give time for Rich to answer some of our questions and respond to our comments. And then what we usually do is after the call finishes, so today we're finishing at, it's going to be 90 minutes call today. So we're finishing at UK time 6:30. Which Eastern time will be 1:30 p.m. And yeah, then we'll have a hangout space where anybody can stay after the call, whoever wants to. Great. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our guest today, Rich Wilson. Rich is CEO of the Iswe Foundation, which is an organization that's developing new ways for people themselves to lead local, national, and global decision-making. He has a wealth of experience in leading climate and democracy movements. And in 2004, he founded the Public Participation Center, Involve, which has been hugely influential here in my home country, in the UK. And Rich has been one of the sort of people at the forefront of the new democracy movement for a number of years. And most recently has co-founded one of the world's first global citizens assembly on the climate and ecological crisis. And Rich and we have been doing a lot of thinking about the sort of the future of citizens' deliberation and what needs to happen. So today he's going to be talking about why citizens' deliberative democracy needs to move beyond needing a mandate from power holders like national and local government. So in these calls in the past, we've focused a lot on various sort of processes that have been commissioned by local and national government. This today is going to be talking about a different model, which is moving towards a movement orchestrated by citizens and stakeholders. And he's going to be talking about a specific example of this, which is the Convention of the Future Armenian, which took place last year and brought together Armenian citizens and the Armenian diaspora to discuss and create collective action in the light of their past and their wanting to create a strong national identity moving forward. So yeah, feel free to take any notes as Rich talks, and he's going to give us a presentation now. So I'll hand over to you, Rich. Welcome.
That's great. Thanks so much, and great to see everyone. And apologies, I'm just at I had a very busy start to the year, and my business kind of ended like literally before this call. I couldn't even do the briefing 10 minutes before, and it literally finished at the end of this call. So I'm like, so for me, this is quite a breathing out moment. So I hope you don't mind if I really feel like I need a stretch. I'm going to share with you some of my current live thinking, which I just have a sense that this audience would find that more useful. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I don't mind whatsoever. Just another, so some of you know who I am. So I started off my career as an academic. Then I worked for the IPCC, and then I worked as a community development worker. And then I spent, in 2004, I founded Involve, which fundamentally was the kind of think and do tank for the Blair and Brown governments, writing lots and lots of policy and delivering lots of processes in different parts of the world. So then I was very much a system insider, chairing various government departments and initiatives, commissioning lots of those kind of projects you'll have heard about. And I've definitely I think when you think about participation professionals, you know, they say if you know the American academics, so they could fall into three categories: the kind of instrumentalists, the substantives, and the normatives. When he said instrumentalists, he meant people who care about a certain outcome, like addressing climate, inequality, etc. It's not instrumentalists that you're trying to manipulate someone. It's that you're doing it because you care about, you know, justice. I am an instrumentalist. I'm doing this because I care about policy outcomes. I'm not I am a substantive as well. I think that the substantive, i.e. improving government, is a good idea. And I think that the normative arguments that it's good in and of itself, you know, is reasonable. But I am definitely in the category of doing it because fundamentally I want to make the world a better place. And it's just useful, I think, to understand that. I've gone from being very much a government insider to being someone now who kind of is both, really. I see myself sometimes, you know, I've got various roles with governments around the world, but I'm also, you know, delivering these processes, sometimes with and sometimes without them. And I think fundamentally where I'm at is you just don't want to get into a permissive relationship with a power holder. We just don't want to deny the power we have got to get democracy done ourselves. And so that's my perspective. You may or may not agree with that. So please, I'm going to share some slides today, very much in the spirit of trying to kind of have a conversation about these things, in the spirit that I am really clear that I don't know how to, say, fix democracy or renew democracy. I've got ideas of pathways we can take, but I do not have answers. And if you have that, I'd love to hear about them. Yeah, so I know this is about Armenia, but when I was reflecting on it, I thought the kind of, if I was rewriting the talk title, I call it Self-Rule, Doing Democracy Ourselves, which is what happened in Armenia. And that's kind of why I use that example. I don't know if any of you saw this. This is very UK-centric, but on the first day of Liz Truss's premiership, she announced a powerful permanent citizens' assembly in the UK, which is to have decision-making power to fix the climate and cost of living crisis. And this bus, you know, was seen in Westminster. Of course, she didn't do that. This was a stunt by some climate activists. But why this is important is that citizens' assemblies have fundamentally become this cause célèbre for the fact that people know that we need, you know, substantial political systems change. I'm sure you've all seen this data here, the Pew data, but there's different versions of this data coming out all around the world now. Fundamentally, there are huge majorities, not just for political systems change, but for major changes. US 85%, the UK is quite low at 52%. These are for people who want major changes. These are not small things. These are talking about, you know, transformative change, really. Again, citizens' assemblies and referendums are popular ideas in various countries. You'll see, but I think I often talk about how we've had three waves of deliberative democracy: citizens' juries, citizens' summits, and now citizens' assemblies. Each one are just a term of an age to define how do we sort out the governance chamber bit of democracy, I think. And these things have been growing as our, as essentially our formal democracies have been struggling to deal with, the state we're in. You know all about this, I'm sure, in this course here, about the driving interest in this. You'll know the deliberative wave data again, I'm sure. I think the really important thing about the deliberative wave data is that it's actually incredibly limited, because it's based upon an assumption of process having sortition selection, being commissioned by government, and lasting for, I think, at least 1 or 2 maybe days. This is really important. Before 2010, sortition really wasn't a thing at all in the liberation world, not at all. And the vast majority of processes, particularly in North America, were funded by philanthropy, which would exclude it from the process. So we think, I know that when I was between 2003 and 2011, 12, when I was really involved in commissioning processes in the UK, I mean, I was involved with commissioning maybe 50 to 100 a year. So this data is definitely a tiny reflection. I think actually what's happened in OECD countries this period is that we've gone down. I think the peak was kind of like between kind of late 90s and 2010, but the popularity of it has gone up globally. So but I think this is, I'm not sure the deliberative wave tells the full story of all of the processes that are taking place, particularly those that are not commissioned by government. But we don't have the data and information. Hopefully that will change in coming years. Fundamentally, I see the current crisis as what I would call, it's governance failure. It's the failure of the fact that our governments are failing to respond and deal with the crisis we face, be it health, pandemics, climate, etc. So it's all very obvious. We're really all experiencing it now in our own lives, aren't we? I don't know how it is for yourselves, but certainly if you're living in the UK and you have your children in school, or you're trying to use social care services, or let's face it, just trying to cross the road because the tarmac's falling off, government no longer works as well as it once did. Essentially, there's a cycle, I think, whereby it's a vicious cycle whereby the crisis and the governments are failing to effectively respond to it, just creates a more difficult situation for the government to act. And we get what I would call an emergency situation, whereby whereby a government just isn't managing to keep us safe. And those famous words of John Stuart Mill, the purpose of those who are governing is to keep us safe. If you're not increasing the safety of people, you lose your right and your legitimacy to govern. And I think that's often when people talk about the legitimacy of government, they kind of forget fundamentally the role of government is to improve our situation or maintain or protect us. That's really what it's about. If you can't do that, which clearly is not happening in many countries around the world, then of course your legitimacy falls away. I just wanted to share this diagram. Some of you might have seen this before. It's an IDO. It's not one of our diagrams. This is an IDO diagram, the Innovation Consultancy, coming from kind of Palo Alto, where you might think of what the innovation journey you're on is. And so the top is like your end result is known. Your bottom is the end result is unknown. Left is the process is new. So the process for developing the technology is new, and the process is familiar. I think we're in a situation at the moment around democratic innovation whereby the end result is not known. I don't think we know exactly what it's going to look like, and I think we're sort of somewhere in the quest zone, maybe kind of in the middle of that. This is really important, because when we're developing and deploying our new democratic processes, we need to be fully aware of the fact that there's a way in which we don't know what we're doing, that we have to have systems that iterate with communities to be able to reflect on what works. Which I think is absolutely critical. When you have people kind of selling particular models that have to be very, very strict in terms of their formality, maybe that's useful in some conditions. But let's say if you're working in a situation like climate, which is where a large number of citizen assemblies are done, you are definitely not in those conditions. Like, we do not know what success looks like. If we did, the Swedes would have sorted it out 30 years ago. This is just building upon that idea a bit more. This is really fresh. I literally only wrote this earlier this week. I've been thinking quite a lot around complexity level and the type of participation you need to manage those complexities. I'm sure I'm assuming this group's really familiar with these kind of ideas, but where you go from kind of simple levels of complexity, whereby there's a known problem with a known solution, such as like how to fix a door or fix a light or whatever, to increasing levels of ones that are more complicated, whereby it is difficult, but if you get the data in place, you can begin to kind of find an effective solution, which is some kind of mental health care issues would be like, or building infrastructure projects. But then as we go down the list, we're thinking of more kind of complex and highly complex situations. I think we're moving into a space whereby, in terms of the participation, agenda, we could say that the citizens citizen summit world of the kind of pre-2010 was very much around trying to have collaboration between people to try and acknowledge that we need to have both people involved. I think now we're in a situation whereby we're having to really devolve power and really become aware of our systems so that we can try and disrupt the situation we're in and really give power to people to work in ways based upon their own culturally specific situations. It's really important. If we're interested in changing the systems, we have to be really much more seeing how we do democracy from a much more systemic lens. I mean, fundamentally, I do a different talk where I talk about good and bad democracy, and and in my view, to really understand how democracy is working today, you have to zoom out and see it as a system. As soon as you see it as a narrow thing to do with voting or even to do with chambers, you don't see the fact that it's the culturally specific element to do with the media, schools, education, self-efficacy, collective perspective, social capital. We have to bring it all in, I think, if we're going to have democracies that are capable of meeting today's challenges. Let's not bother with that quote. I chucked this blog into the chat earlier. This diagram. This is about being politically literate. I used to be a climate lobbyist working in the UK Parliament. Politics and change is a dirty business. It's got the dark arts in it. We can't, when we're running these processes, if we assume that we can just write a report and that even if a decision maker says that they're going to implement it, that they almost always don't. This is the myth, in a way, of this idea of getting a strong contract with your decision maker. I think the Macron example of the Convention Citoyenne de Climat and the recent one on the choice around dying in France, a really interesting example of how the leader's commitment can really amplify the impact of a process, but he didn't actually do what they said they wanted to do in any of those cases. Now we have, I think it's something like, and don't quote me on it, it's something like, is it 40 to 50% of the recommendations for the climate process in France being implemented, which is really quite amazing given how radical some of them were. But most of them weren't, even though he said he would. In most parts of the world that I've operated in, even when you get the docking with institutional power, they don't implement it in the end. They just listen to it. And then I think there's a real risk that that essentially what we're doing with deliberative processes is we are providing a facade and an impression of legitimacy to institutions which are not going to act in the way that people want them to. And I think this is a huge risk in the democracy space, that we are naive if we don't think that's how politics can work in practice. I got trained by an organization called America Speaks in the 21st century town hall meeting, kind of citizen summit style, back in the very early noughties. Their theory of change was all about trying to build the confidence and efficacy of the participants to leave the room and to affect change themselves. Very much a community organizing kind of spirit. You can feel it really kind of coming out of Chicago. I think you really need to integrate that into any of the processes you're doing now. Otherwise, you've got really high risk of impact. And fundamentally, we need to think about the insiders, the relationships within the insider politics, but also the outsider tactics, movements, campaigns, etc., etc. This is the John Gaventa Power Cube. Fundamentally, this is just about trying to get us to get really clear about where power really lies. The vast majority of citizens' assembly type processes are what you might call invited or closed spaces, whereby you are being asked to have conversations about visible power, like legal bits of power, policy, but the power exists in, back rooms, in deals that are done at different levels, or often in these kind of different spaces, and of course both within the kind of NGO, but also within the formal space. So getting really clear about where power really lies, really important, I think, how we do our processes if we want to have an impact, which I definitely do. Okay, Armenia. So the Convention of the Future Armenia. So I don't know how familiar people are with Armenia, but it's a country it's a new country, well, an ancient country, very, very old country with the first Christian church in the world, but also one of the first countries to become independent following the collapse of the USSR, but in the last few years having a high level of security issues. And one of the parts of Armenia that was an independent state is currently been taken back by Azerbaijan, called Artsakh. So it's a country that's got huge and major security issues. I think population, I think it's 2.3 million. Don't quote me on that again. It's the end of the week here, but something like that. So this process was undertaken. It was undertaken in it's actually not really a citizens' assembly. It was very much a citizen summit style. But they did use sortition globally, and they are attempting to create a new governance chamber running in parallel to the formal government. It's very, very interesting. One of the things that I learned from the process, most importantly of all, is they set up something called an affiliation network, which consisted of journalists, civil society organizations, businesses, all kinds of very important and influential individuals and organizations in Armenia who would commit to supporting the convention and then implementing the recommendations. So the idea has been to create a permanent convention. It was run in March of last year. And in fact, I've got a meeting on Monday morning to talk about how it can be kind of continued and renewed for 2024. There's been a bit of a delay in it because of the huge security issues that have been going on in Armenia. But what's been really striking is how they've claimed a new political space. They tried to work with the government, and they tried to invite the government in, but the government, so far haven't kind of given their endorsement. There were some ministers speaking at the event. The sortition was really radical. They had, I think it was 40% of the participants were from the diaspora, and they had advertisements in California and Paris and other parts of the world, and Moscow, where there's a substantial bit of the diaspora. So what they're trying to do is create a global network of members of Armenian citizens, diaspora and residents, to really be there to support the future of the country. They are rightly worried about the survival of the country. There are plans by various countries very explicitly around the world to eliminate Armenia. I mean, Armenia, is in a very fragile state. It has lost a lot of territory over the last few years, and there's a real chance that it could get swallowed up by other countries. So it's dominated by this kind of this fragility, and I think because of that, they're worried about losing their ancient culture, what it really means to be Armenian. And so this convention comes from that space whereby there is not a belief that the government is going to be capable of being able to necessarily protect the culture, protect what it means to be Armenian, particularly given the enormous challenges the country has, not just the challenges that everyone has, cost of living, climate, etc., but they have the security issues too, making it extraordinarily difficult. So the convention has been set up in that basis. I know they want to move to a more digital platform way of doing it from this year. But the idea is to get a permanent structure whereby people can talk about the future of the country and what the kind of various priorities are. One of the remarkable things that happened last year is following the convention, it was very, very high profile in the country, all across the media and the news, etc., is many organizations moved in to support it. So essentially they set up this new governance process, and then various other institutions of power went in behind it saying, yes, we support it, and we will do our best to implement the recommendations coming from it, because it provides a governance chamber that has got real legitimacy, and by implication, it maybe even to many people more legitimacy and the formal and informal government structures themselves. So super interesting example. This is the theory of change. It's in the papers. I know it's really geeky. At the top of the theory of change, we've got this kind of attempt to influence institutions, get citizens to take actions, and provide this kind of proof of concept of what a new governance chamber for Armenia might look like. But critically, this affiliation network, the yellow things down here, which is really about trying to really build a power block of supporters who are going to implement the recommendations of the convention. Super interesting. I just thought I'd throw in here the Global Citizens Assembly, which is our big piece of work being launched, hopefully by Gutierrez at the Summit for the Future in September of this year. Hopefully that's going to happen. It's a similar civil society initiated project. This is the theory of change for that, kind of similar model, but we have these three components here: the kind of core citizens assembly, which operates in a normal citizens assembly way, but then community assemblies that anyone can run anywhere. And then we're now learning from what was done in Armenia to create this impact network that you see at the start here. So just in case you haven't come across it, there's a core assembly for the project, which was demographically representative of 100 people. We're hoping to have 300 people when the permanent one gets launched in September. Community assemblies, we're developing a digital platform now to be able to really scale these. So the point being here is that we want to get to 10 million people by 2030. I mean, it'll take a lot to get there, but that's the goal. These are some of them. And then we also work with cultural activities. But the point being here, I just wanted to give another illustration of this kind of civil society-led citizen assemblies. Now, we are being supported by the IPCC, by the UN Secretary General's Office, by the UN Foundation. We've got a paper coming out from the UN Foundation next month supporting the setup of a permanent Global Citizens Assembly. So we initiated it ourselves, but once that power has been established, that space has been claimed, to use Gaventa's language, other institutions have come in behind it. And we've been really supported again and again by many institutional insiders. So that's the best way to do it. If we try to do it in a permissive way. And one of the things I'm really noticing at the moment is when I have conversations with people, particularly at a community level, about setting up their own. So you may or may not be aware, there's a whole movement globally now of people setting up their own community citizen assemblies in their community. Is they often want to get into this permissive relationship with the government, like, should we do it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I had this fantastic conversation in a UK local authority area before Christmas. A very nice green councillor came up to me. She said, Richard, what's the point in setting up this assembly when you haven't got permission or a commitment from the local authority to be able to act on it? And I said to her, I said, even if the next government comes in and they double your money, they double it, this is not going to happen, but let's say they double it. So will you have enough resources to cover your infrastructure improvements, improving the pay of your staff, and for dealing with things like, polycrisis challenges, climate, etc.? She said, absolutely not. I said, exactly. The reason we have to do democracy ourselves is because the old ways of governing don't make sense in a kind of polycrisis world. And she thought, yeah, that makes sense. We need systems to galvanize the community. And said, that's it. That's why we want to do it. And what we're noticing is that when people set these community assemblies up themselves, just like in Armenia, people come in behind them. Could be media, could be money that's being raised, could be organizations. But people are hungry for new forms of legitimate governance that have got new forms of power that give us hope in relation to the polycrisis. This is when we presented the Global Assembly at the COP26. That's it from me, basically. That's the kind of presentation. But I think fundamentally here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build and prototype, very much in a Buckminster Fuller type of way, the new governance structures that we can begin to, that can expand the power of everyone in relation to the multiple challenges we face.
Fantastic, Rich. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving a very inspirational presentation there after what's clearly been a long day for you. Really appreciate this spirit of sort of honesty around what's going on in the field of citizens deliberation, and that we don't necessarily know where we're going, and at the same time providing a possibility for change and a possibility that could bring hope to people in a kind of new model that gives people agency. So great, thank you so much. What's coming up next is I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to reflect on everything you've just presented in terms of the Wise Democracy Pattern Language, which is a tool that Tom and also Martin, who's on this call today, have worked together in creating a number of years ago. And yeah, I'll hand over to Tom to share some of the patterns from that pattern language that you see present in what Rich has just presented. So Tom, are you with us? I know you had bandwidth problems earlier, but okay, you're going to join with the phone.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. Yes, it actually goes beyond the patterns in an interesting way. I'm getting the sense, I mean, I've known about Iswe for a while, but haven't really dug into it, but I sense that Iswe and the Co-Intelligence Institute are kind of neighbors, not yet partners, but neighbors on the leading edge of deliberative democracy, that a lot of the things we're thinking of and doing work in are very similar. I see Iswe moving towards embracing greater complexity than most of the deliberative democracy world is. I see it embracing more of the extent of crisis, to be able to easily talk about polycrisis as a central issue, rather than this or that piece of the polycrisis. So I value that perspective, and the greater focus on systemic transformation, which is related to the level of crisis that we're talking about, and the sense of both institutionalizing deliberative democracy and doing deliberative democracy outside of established institutions, that having that both of those focuses, trying to spread deliberative democracy in both of those ways. I find that very inspiring, and I sense there's also an awareness that the power of deliberative democracy to create a context in which institutions and officials and pundits, whatever, have to respond to things in a different way, because you're actually creating a we the people sense of agency and sense of awareness, and you change the context within which the institutions are operating. So all of that I sense from what you said about the Rich, about the focus of Iswe, that is very much in line with where the inquiries that we're taking in the Co-Intelligence Institute. In the sense of the patterns, is of course the thing that's going on here has lots of sortition. We almost overlooked the sortition, which is the random selection and deliberation. These are so common to the deliberative democracy movement right now, but those are patterns in our Wise Democracy pattern language. But what sets it, some of the things that set it apart are from the citizen engagement side. We have a pattern called microcosms and populations, and it covers the idea of the mini publics, the citizen assemblies, citizen summits, and whatever. The idea of having randomly selected people coming together to think on behalf of the larger whole, and to sort of condense the potential wisdom of the whole in a way that could be used by officialdom or the population. But having a connection between that and the larger populations from which they're taken, that the microcosms and populations pattern embraces both of those with an aspiration towards the links between them. And we sense a lot of Iswe's work in this design, the design of the Armenian project. There was a great sense of engaging broader scope of the population into this, and having people, individual citizens all over the place, giving input that was then provided to the mini public as information for them to digest and come up with their recommendations, and have those recommendations then reviewed by the larger population. And that feedback loop between the microcosm and the macrocosm is something we've been pushing for a while. And that collective distributed intelligence, sort of crowdsourcing energy, is also featured in part of that, the sense of there are lots of people with lots of ideas and lots of wisdom and experience out there in the world, that if we have proper technologies, social and digital technologies, we can tap into that level of available collective intelligence distributed out to the whole society. And that you're doing innovations in that as part of connecting the microcosm to the population. So all of that little cluster of things has been, it's been inspiring to watch what you're doing. There's a couple of other innovations in that, but not much going on. And to see you at the leading edge of that one, it's very exciting. There's a whole nother branch of our democracy theorizing. One branch has the citizens as central, and the other has the stakeholders as central, in the sense of citizens as members of a place, and that stakeholders are members or participants in some issue domain. And the sense of, number one, the realizing that there is, if you are inclusive about your stakeholders, if you can bring all the stakeholders together, everybody who's impacted by or impacting or has resources for or knowledge about, if you can bring all those together, they're the people who are already doing work in a particular field, domain. One of the original places I contacted was a woman, Tracy Kunkel, associate of ours, who has for well over a decade been doing work with food systems in Appalachia in the US. And there's all these different players deciding what's happening within food systems in Appalachia. And they used to not be coordinated, and she has helped weaving them into conversations and collaborations so that they are co-creating consciously what's happening on the ground. And her realization was this is an emerging form of governance, and that is based on a particular domain, such as food systems. And the idea of the, future of Armenia could be another domain. But what you're doing is engaging the stakeholders, the different multi-sectors. You're looking at the multi-sector dimension. All the people in the different sectors, the businesses, the government people, the nonprofits, you're pulling them together as part of the citizen inquiry that's going on. You're doing experiments in how to combine both the citizen dimension of the whole of what we're trying to deal with and the stakeholder section. So the citizen stakeholder integration pattern is one of our most aspirational places, particularly facing the meta crisis, where we have tremendous complexity and there are people on the ground already doing work, and to the extent they can be brought into some form of congruence, shared perspective, then there can be self-organization, to foster people doing what makes sense to them collectively, given shared orientation, shared full spectrum information, shared purposes. The sense of, if you have all those things in place, the system can organize itself. You don't have to have some external force like the government doing implementation. It's not a matter of doing implementation. It's a matter of, oh, this is what makes sense. You shift in what you're doing, their sense of what makes sense changes. So collectively, there's a new emergent sense of what's needed. Then everybody, all the players start doing that. And that potential, you are on a leading edge of figuring out how to manifest that potential in ways that we find very exciting. And the fact that it is an iterative, you're also imagining not just as an event, but as an iterative process, having some forum structure into which people flow in and out, and information flows in and out, and action flows in and out of this institutional structure. Things continually happen, and you can newly respond to what realities are changing which again, in terms of the meta crisis or poly crisis, changes are going to be happening fast and frequently in many different zones. And this is beginning to prototype what kind of institutional arrangement might be possible to think collectively and behave, transform, shift our thinking and action. So that's also very exciting. And the last thing is sort of where all this comes together is in what we call the prime directive, which is to appreciate, evoke, and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. And there's various ways to take the whole, various ways to talk about, you know, what is wisdom, what is resourcefulness, et cetera, et cetera. But you are manifesting something that is a clear prototype of appreciating, evoking, engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. And that is something that lots of different people working in this field could, if they choose, orient themselves toward and start doing their own innovations and conversations, prototyping, whatever, to evolve this field in the direction that you're leading us in. So super appreciative. I'm doing a little namaste here. You can't see because my connection is so horrible. But thank you so much for the work you're doing. Check.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for getting through, even if you had to do it by your mobile phone. What I think would be great now is maybe if we just take maybe, like a 5-minute pause. I mean, I think Rich might appreciate that as well, given he's had a busy day, to just collect your thoughts and get down any sort of comments or questions that you might have. And, you know, on the sort of wider model of how citizens' deliberation could affect change, or on the specific case of the convention, the Future Armenian. And if there are any sort of specific questions around the process or whatever you want to ask on that, feel free. But yeah, it would be good to have just a few minutes now pause where people can think, get their ideas down, and then let's say if we do exactly 5 minutes to my clock, that will be 58. Yeah, so we're going to have some comments, questions from people in the call, and now we've got about 25 minutes of a more sort of informal, open discussion. So I see Rosa. What would you?
There he is. Yeah, I was just saying thank you to Andy and to you, Rich, for this wonderful talk. I was very interested at the beginning. You mentioned how people sometimes get fixated on mandates, and I just wanted to mention that at the Democracy R&D conference in Denmark, Professor Lars Tonder had a wonderful comment, which I thought was very relevant. He was talking about mandates. This is one of his learnings from the process of an assembly that they've just done. But mandates is a dynamic phenomenon that need to be nourished, maintained, contested, and are part of the greater institutional ecosystem. And I thought it was a very helpful way of looking at this whole thing. And it also, you know, when you are claiming space, right, you are claiming a mandate, but then you also talked about how then it was filled in by people and organizations coming in behind you and supporting you, which I think is really crucial, because I've been part of, well, I haven't been part of the first one, but you know, we've had two interesting, very different experiences here. One was the Wisdom Council in Ashland, and the other one was the Wisdom Council in Asheville. And we had very different experiences in terms of a lack of people coming in to fill in, or institutions or organizations. So I do think that it's super important that when we talk about claim space, that we're, you know, have a sophisticated understanding of all the various sources of power, whether it's academic or nonprofit or organizational or network, that can come in and need to come in and support for these things to be effective. So the last thing on this is just a story, and it's not my story. I don't know, I think I heard it from you, Martin, which I think was such an example of claiming power with regard to the Austrian National Climate Assembly, where apparently there was not a very strong, so instead of mandate, let's talk about effective relationship for follow through with the national level politicians at the beginning, and the people who designed this process were very aware of the importance of these dynamic phenomena that need to be nourished and maintained and sometimes created, and so went and spoke with the politicians and public administrators at the local level, where the people had come from who were sortition-based chosen for the assembly, asking these local politicians, you know, how do you feel about about one of the people from your community being one of the people who was chosen to be part of this, and what would your recommendations be for the national level politicians and public administrators? How should they respond to the recommendations of this council? And it was very, very crucial, because by the time they had accumulated a number of positive statements saying, oh, we think it's wonderful that somebody from our town is part of this, and we've had this experience at a local level, and it has been so powerful, and we think that the national folks should listen seriously to these recommendations, that built up quite the momentum. Whereas before, you know, this had all been assumed as, oh, this is a green initiative, and if we're part of any other party, we don't need to listen, right? So to me, that's such a powerful story of the dynamic phenomenon of claiming a mandate, creating a mandate, constructing a mandate, and the importance of building from the ground up. So I just wanted to kind of put that into the pot, and curious about your thoughts on it.
Should I respond directly? Is that the right? Is that what you do here? Yeah. So I mean, thanks so much, Rosa, and thanks also, Tom. That's really there's lots in all of that. I mean, so on this, it's interesting, isn't it? This whole mandates conversation. Look, there's something about this obsession about mandate. There's something about it that I think there's probably good and bad mandates, something like that. I'm just riffing, responding to what you're saying, Rose, because I think mandates are desirable. I think there's just something, you know, if we're in we want to be in an adult relationship with you know, everyone essentially, you know, to take I think transactional analysis is a super helpful frame in a kind of nourishing, empowering, enabling adult relationship. And I think if mandates are, you know, agreed or not, you know, politically, literally, and non-naively constructed to kind of really acknowledge that, because I think we have a problem. You know, we're I don't know how many, you know, how, you know, let's say we're 100 years into kind of consumer capitalism really being pushed really hard. I do think that is a psychological root of the lack of power that so many people feel and experience, and just the way. So we're in a situation whereby, you know, we have got a society constructed in ways whereby we're being constantly sedated. This is my view. This is my belief. I think it's obvious to and so that's so we need to really work so hard in this mandate construction that we're not setting up these unhelpful parent-child faceted relationships. And if I'm honest, I think most mandates do that. Then there may be brilliant examples that don't. There really might be. In fact, I'm sure they are. And I love that idea of nourishing and maintaining. And in mandate could just simply be a descriptor of a relationship that one hopes will become, you know, in the same way when you might be in a marriage or a family constellation, you're seeking to kind of, you know, construct that in the most, you know, helpful way possible. But very, very often, I think a lot of people in our field are they are either over optimistic of the capability of our leaders to act in the face of the crisis, or frankly, they are co-opted into the system, and they don't realize that they're effectively shoring up a system which is taking us towards a crisis. And I've just seen it happen so many times that good people, whether they go into parliaments or whether they start working in the civil service, but essentially, they, like all of us in any situation they live, you have to be so attentive to losing touch with what's really needed. And I think there's something about the field of deliberative democracy that I feel like parts of it are highly vulnerable to being, shoring up status quo relationships that are no longer serving us.
So if I may do a follow-up, like I think that you're talking about the importance of countervailing power, right? The ability to I know I remember having translated or interpreted before for some indigenous leaders from Ecuador who were telling a story in Berkeley, California, of having led these mass mobilizations, nonviolent, peaceful marches where the indigenous people were at the forefront, have marched on Quito and demanded their rights, etc., petitions, and then being pacified, essentially being said, oh yes, we'll sit down at the table, we'll negotiate, we'll agree to this stuff, we'll have a new government, and then the new government just going and doing the same thing that the old government had done. This happened repeatedly in several cycles. So it's this whole question of how can dialogue, how can negotiation be used as a way to pacify people and to promise things that then are not followed through on. And so I think it's a very important point that you're raising about how we need to be sophisticated with our awareness of how these processes can be co-opted. Thank you so much.
Sorry, did you want to come back again, Rich?
Oh, sorry, I was going to come out very quickly. And I think this is really my experience of actors right now who are at least seeking to be conscious of countervailing powers is sometimes they're like absolutely at the center. Sometimes there might be, politicians, business leaders. It's kind of got nothing to do with where you sit. That's my sense. It's some of the most radical people I know like work for the UN and realize we need to really, and of course some of them are also hardcore activists in other parts of the world. So the reason I think this is something really, really important about not that you were saying this at all, Rosa, but it just made me think about how the allies of the kinds of transformative work we're trying to work with are found everywhere. They really, really are, and in fact, there's a cusp of kind of, if you like, civil society organizations who kind of depend upon money from government, and they're often some of the most resistant to change that we work with. And then there are some members of the deliberative democracy world who I think unfortunately fall into that trap, just simply because of the economics of their livelihood depend upon, or their perception is the economics of their livelihood depend upon essentially keeping conventional, the status quo happy. But sorry, Tom.
Nothing to apologize for. Yeah, one of the things I realized over the last couple of years is that in the vast majority of cases, the citizen assemblies and other mini publics are in effect a sophisticated form of petitioning the government. The tradition of petitioning the government is, from back in the king's world, where you ask the king, please help me with this. And that the king has been replaced with presidents and legislators and parliaments and whatever. And we petition those in a sophisticated way where we've looked at the issue and we've done a lot of homework. We say, look at our homework, which of these things will you do, kind of thing. But the idea of petitioning as the narrative versus the narrative of citizen stakeholder agency, they're actually the government is one of many players in any given circumstance. And yes, we want the government in our governance system, but that the governance system has full-scale players engaged in the activity, and it's no longer, 90% of the agents involved petitioning 10% of the agents involved. It's more, let's collectively do something about this issue, and I sense that your work is moving strongly in that direction, and that's what the Iswe. It actually should be are we, but that would make it all bad. We is not correct. Because, but if you made it are we, it would sound like a question. So works out. Anyway, I'm again appreciating the narrative you framed for what it is you're doing and how much that resonates with the leading edge of our own work. Okay.
Would you like to respond to that, or we can take it?
Well, I think I will respond, but maybe we'll, if there's gather some more.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah.
Anybody else have comment or question? If not, I certainly do have one. Jennifer, you just come on. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm very interested and excited in what happened in the Armenian example, and in particular, what I've been interested in for a while is how the multi-stakeholder processes, and particularly there's groups like people like Tracy, who Tom mentioned, and also Russ Gaskin and others who are working in the multi-stakeholder space around how do we create systems change. And I'm very curious how that interweaves with the civic assemblies and these approaches of gathering the we the people kind of perspectives. And I feel like there are gifts and limitations to each of these approaches, and that when they weave together, there's much more power for transformative change. And I was really attracted to what you said about allies of transformation are found everywhere. I think that's really true. And so I guess the question is, I'm intrigued to learn more about, in the Armenian example, how they engaged the stakeholder processes, sort of where and when. And then I'd love, not necessarily on this call, but at some point, longer dialogues around the ways in which the civic agency and civic voice can be cultivated in partnership with the ways in which multi-stakeholder networks, if done well and from a perspective of collaborative governance, can have a whole nother level of capacity for implementation, for understanding of complexity and of power, and how those two can work together in interacting in ways that can more effectively produce the level of power and change that we're talking about needing in partnership or sidestepping, or in parallel with the standard government process.
So, I mean, I think it was from 2000 or 2002 so I spent a few years working on multi-stakeholder processes, mainly stakeholder dialogue processes on kind of like supply chains or like how to address big, the usual stuff. And I mean, I left working on those kind of things because I ended up, in the end, I remember, I mean, it's interesting when I think what was really good about the Armenian process is it wasn't. I wouldn't call the affiliation that, I wouldn't use the language of stakeholder to describe that, but you can, and it's fine. But essentially what we had in parallel was they were kind of like government committees, really, who kind of came together and they just said, and there was more like coalition building. That's what it was like. So it wasn't like a dialogue whereby you were going to co-agreeing how you might manage supply chain or this kind of thing. It was more like, how do we set the agenda for the for the assembly as a governance chamber in and of itself, and we agreed to implement its things that are coming out of it. And I think what was good about it was in a way simple. It was just like, we will support this chamber, and we will act on what it says as far as we can. And it's really, I think it's a really interesting question, Jennifer, and I don't really have the answer, to be honest. I think where my brain goes as I start thinking about how you could see those. I've got to be honest, most of my experience in multi-stakeholder process is pretty depressing. I'm just going to be honest with you. That is not my experience of a lot of the citizen assemblies processes. A lot of them are very inspiring, and things do happen, and people's, I don't know. I mean, this goes back to Tom's point. Is like, we talk about type 3 communication, but it's really when you're going down the bottom. I'm sure everyone's really familiar with Otto Scharmer's due process type work. So we're to communicate it to people who aren't really into that kind of like social psychological lens. We talk about type 3 communication. One is like traditional political discourse. Type 2 is when you look at your underlying assumptions, and type 3 is your governing sentiment. So you'll be there on an issue like abortion, and you'll say, I'm a pro-choicer, I'm a pro-lifer. We're not going to try and convince each other at all but we're just going to sit there and deeply listen about our governing sentiment and try and really understand each other. And I think for me, when these processes are at their most effective are when I think consensus has really been I think the language of consensus has been really problematic around these processes for many years now. And I'm super uninterested in anything that tries to do consensus. What I'm interested in is any processes that tries to create deep connection between people, to create deep respect and love between them. And this is what, in the Boston Conversations Project, which you might know about, it's a beautiful process whereby the pro-choicers and pro-lifers expressed love with each other. They felt their own positions were more true after the process than before, but they had deep respect and even love, which enabled them to put in policies to protect, vulnerable young women. This is, for me, the magic. This is where I do my job, because I'm fundamentally trying to create conditions and systems which cultivate love between people. Now, whether that's a stakeholder process or whether the beauty of citizens-led processes, and I was discussing that, Andy knows my kind of colleague, Claire, and we were discussing this the other evening, is we were both saying how we like working with citizens because we feel like we are able to create the conditions of deep respect between those groups. It is a lot harder in a stakeholder process, or at least it is for me. At least it is for me. And for me, that's what we're trying to do here. Fundamentally, I'm interested in engineering governance structures and conditions which can create love between people who've got diametrically opposite positions.
Just a quick response. That's beautiful, Rich, and I really appreciate what you just shared. And I would toss in sort of two perspectives. Like what I'm hearing for you around your experience with multi-stakeholder processes. There's a group that's called MSI Watch, Multi-Stakeholder, I forget what Initiative Watch, and it's basically lambasting, saying that these processes, the multi-stakeholder processes, have not done what they have expressed to do. But then there's folks like Tracy and Russ, who we are connected to, who I think are working on a multi-stakeholder kind of approach that gets to that kind of deep love and systems change perspective. And so it'd be really, I'd appreciate a chance to engage with you and with them around like really quality processes that get to that level of depth, but that maybe come from a slightly different orientation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Rosa, you have your hand, and I have a question as well to follow on after. Go for it, Rosa.
Yeah, so kind of to follow up and build on what Jennifer said, I get that a lot of times when people are looking for practical outcomes, they kind of shift into kind of negotiation or horse trading or a very instrumental mode, which tends to preclude the kind of deep human connection, deep appreciation. And I'm delighted that you're using the love word Rich. One of my mentors, Roger Harrison, was one of the first people to speak about love in an organizational context. And it was really like this big thing to do, right? And I think that similarly right now in the deliberative democracy world, which is often very positivistic, it seems to me, it's a really big deal to speak about love. So I'm delighted. And I think that for me, that's the exciting place, right? Which, as Jennifer was talking about, high quality processes, I think that we can find shared ways forward, even on a practical level, without getting, totally left brain about it and excluding people's sense of being whole human beings. And and yet that is a danger, right? Which is why the Bohmian folks would say that, oh no, you can't do Bohmian dialogue if you're talking about practical stuff, because that's just going to tweak the whole process. And so for me, that's the place where I get really excited about ways of integrating right and left sides of the brain, and really placing the quality of the relationship at the forefront, while also really being open to practical outcomes. So yeah, that's all.
Charlie, I saw in the chat you would like to ask a question. I can let you go first as a participant.
Okay, I don't know who needs to drop promptly or who can hang. But thanks. Hi, everyone, and Rich, thank you so much. Wow, just soaking it up. I don't know if it's really one question, but here's a go. And obviously, pretty sort of high level, broad strokes in what I want to bring in, which is, and I put into the chat. Now, I was a little bit fixing some food, but I didn't hear you mention in the sort of the prelude about Armenia the word genocide, and I wanted to bring that in. And then Tom replied that it's certainly like part of the underpinnings, which I didn't really have a chance to check out. So I kind of have maybe two parts. Let's see if this works. So bringing in the word and sort of just to acknowledge that the meaning and the definitions over time have been evolving, and of course the global understanding and awareness of all this. But then I was curious, about your shift in the focus from climate to population recovery, or however you want to label it. And then, anything broad, like this is, apart from the process and the assemblies and so on, like patterns, we're pattern people here, patterns of climate and patterns of genocide. I mean, this is kind of where my mind was wandering a bit. And just, the origins of either both and how they might overlap in the learnings, but also addressing and effecting shifts in systems. So that's probably plenty. Thanks so much. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so in terms of of course, in the Armenia, I mean, look, I've now been to Yerevan quite a lot of times, and I've been around Armenia, so I know it a lot better than I did, 2 years ago, but I am not an Armenian expert. And of course, I know about the genocide and the history of, and I've tried to teach myself about the history of the country. I mean, so how we did that process is we were strategic advisors of Armenian-based organizations who did everything. So we have a point we try to never, ever, ever deliver citizen process ourselves. We always work with local practitioners who, we want to build local capability. We don't want to be extractivist about it. In terms of the genocide, and obviously it's writ large in the culture in all kinds of ways. I don't feel well placed to, one of the incredible things about the process, which isn't about genocide, but it's about conflict. So in the middle of, I think it was the end of day one, and within the process, there was a decision that they were going to visit some of the war graves in Yerevan. And I saw it and I thought, well, that's never come up in a process I've been involved with before. And I thought to myself, is that going to bias? You know, that's a very powerful thing to do. Is it going to somehow bias the process to do something like that? And then I spoke to the Armenian team, and they were like, "We've got to go. It's got to happen." And I'm like, "No, of course we're going to go there." And then you go and visit the war graves, and of course, because you're bringing the diaspora in from around the world, people are going to meet their friends who died in recent conflicts. You've got to go because they're only there for a few days. It's absolutely a duty out of respect to do that. And of course, it's extraordinarily powerful to do that process. And so I'd never done a process before that had been where security, or death, or it was so real and live, and that of course that affects things. People in Armenia, people are absolutely very justifiably concerned that their country won't exist in the very near future. They're very concerned about that. And so I think the genocide experience is really writ large. In terms of your point around climate shifting to population growth, I didn't understand what you meant by that, actually. So
again, kind of surface level, because I didn't sort of check to look up some of the stuff before the call on your work. But if I understand, you were very involved in climate assemblies, and then you kind of got this project going. So I didn't get the arc of if there's something to say about that.
No, there is nothing. So I've done a lot of these processes. I've been doing them for since the year 2000. I don't know how many I've been involved with commissioning or delivering, but probably. I don't like to, I'm told to not talk about the numbers because it's very, very large numbers of many different topics. Climate is my base issue, so I used to work with IPCC, but we'll tend to work on anything. What I will say about climate now that I think is important is that I think climate has effectively become the route into systems change. And almost all of the climate assemblies we do, whether it's global or local, they're not about climate. They're about systems change, changing how we live, but that's just the easiest way to start having that conversation with most people. Yeah, and I think the COPs are a really interesting example of that. So of course the narrative around COPs is it's a waste of time, it's a circus, they shouldn't happen. Another narrative is they're the biggest conferences on the planet, political conferences. They're not there. They're almost as much about health as they are about climate. They are by far the biggest UN conference. They're way bigger than the UN General Assembly, way bigger, completely incomparably bigger. And essentially, they're about people around the world together trying to work out how the fuck we respond to the situation, and that is it. And of course they're a mess, and of course they're dysfunctional. But our view on it is that if they are a really useful thing to be part of, to build out from the new. And now I also have a view that as dysfunctional as the UN is, we are better off with it than without it. You might not agree with that. That is my view. Not everyone in my team would agree with that, to be honest, but that is my view.
I would love to a quick tag on it. I'm not sure if you can hang a little bit more, Rich, but
Charles, no, I want to make sure that Rich can go at 6:30. So
okay. If there's time, I'll come back. Thanks.
Maybe follow up with questions afterwards. But we're coming up to 6:30 now in the UK, and just want to really thank you, Rich. It's been really interesting and really rich to hear. An alternative, a different way forward, and something that really resonates with us. And we'd love to maybe, have further conversations in the future about this kind of thing.
Thanks everyone. Really, really grateful. And I'm actually, it's one of my very best friend's birthdays. It's a big one happening. It started 30 minutes ago. He only organized it on Wednesday, so I really should go. But anyway, thank you. Thanks everyone. And I think, the focus on, I think like Tom said around wisdom, and what felt to me like wisdom in relationship, you could say love, is really needs to be where we focus. And I do think that when people in this space get distracted from those two things, people like yourself, bringing them back, it's critical.
that is something that I personally, and I think CII would love to follow up with you on. So, yeah, let's be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.